Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us today as we continue to hear from a wide range of Aussie and global specialists and practitioners when it comes to multiplication and church planting. But before we jump into our episode today, we wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about our sponsor for this podcast, the Church Co. The Church Co is a website and app platform specifically designed for and with churches and church planters in mind. And the best part is that they actually build the website and app for you, so you don't have to spend exorbitant amounts of time, money, and energy learning a new tool. You might think that this would cost a whole bunch, but they are a ministry. And the price is similar to hosting a website at simply $29 a month. Also, the best part is that they are based here in Australia, so they understand the Aussie church and are building amazing tools with and for the Australian church in mind. So we want to strongly encourage you to check out the Church Co, as well as some promotional opportunities that we have with them. That's all from us for now, and we hope that you enjoyed this fortnight's episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, welcome to the podcast today. We're so glad that you are able to join us again. And today we are joined by Pat Hegarty. Pat is the lead pastor of Kimmel Church, has been involved in all sorts of different ministry contexts that we're going to hear about today, and also is the recently appointed national leader of M4. Pat, it is so great to have you on the podcast today.
Good to be with you, Charlie. Pleasure.
Awesome. Well, hey, before we hear about some of those things that I've just listed off, and we're going to dive particularly today into M4 for those who haven't heard of what M4 is, particularly when it comes to the church planting landscape around the globe, but particularly here in Australia as the national leader. How do you give us a bit of sketch of your life, how you found yourself as a follower of Jesus, in church leadership, doing the different things that you do, your family? Give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of Pat.
A sketch of a sketchy life. Maybe we should call it that. It's pretty ordinary life from my side. I guess it's the only one I've ever had, but been married to my wife Trish for 36 years, 2 grown kids, 6 grandsons to keep me occupied. Love spending a lot of time with them. As far as a Christian upbringing and where I was brought up, I'm a Penrith, Mount Druitt boy, so western suburbs of Sydney, Charlie. We've got a lot in common there. But I had an atheistic upbringing. Based more on my parents' sort of inherited experience, historically, of their sort of Catholic convent type of experience. So that put me against Christians. And so I had a bit of a reputation at school for persecuting Christians. Funnily enough, though, I became one at the age of 19. I was the easiest convert you'd ever come across in the end. Someone just explained to me the gospel, and there I was. But when it comes to discipleship, I found in practice it was probably easier to take the boy out of Penrith than the Penrith out of the boy, if you know what I mean. So I had a pretty intense journey. I was saved into a very comprehensively founded discipleship church, Gosford Baptist, back in the day. And they gave me a very, what I would now call a hardcore discipleship experience, which really grounded me very well. And I cut my teeth on systematic theology and all those sorts of things, became quite a nerd for theology. But as far as my career, I started as a motor mechanic of all things, left that as quickly as I could, and went into studying engineering, mechanical design, and so on. Had my first startup company at 27, creating earth-moving machines and designing those. Ended up drifting into executive management, then got bored by the time I was about 32, I think it was. Started my own business in the internet, did that for a while. And then at age 40, ended up in full-time ministry. And that earlier discipleship experience really of 20 years with God really fueled what became my ministry focus, which was really all about growth, discipleship, because I'd been through such a formative journey myself, transformation, miraculous change, incredible disciplines that I had to exercise just to get that old ways of thinking out of my system. That became a big deal for me in that I think I could have done that better. I think if the church or the churches that I'd been part of had known more about formation, discipleship, how people grow, how God grows us, I'm sure I could have cut that process a bit shorter, and it could have been maybe just a bit less painful. And so I invested the first 11 years of my ministry life just trying to discern, how does God grow people? What's the Spirit's involvement in that? What's the Spirit trying to do? And what part of church can play in that? So as a formation and leadership pastor in a large church, that was my focus for all that time. But eventually I moved out of there to become a senior minister at my own sort of medium-sized church. But that's when this journey really began for me, in the sense that I began to see a trending happening in the Australian churches that very few people seem to be talking about, in that the big churches were getting bigger, and I was happy with that. I'd come from a big church, but the small churches were getting fewer. But what I began to see is that people were asking for a certain sort of church, and that sort of church was disappearing. So the demand was getting higher, but the supply was getting lower. And I went about having 1,200 interviews in the end with people to find out what they needed from church and get to the bottom of all that, because there were far more people looking for healthy churches than there were healthy churches to be found by the look of it. And it didn't look good for the future. So I sort of came up with a new plan about how we would do church in a different way, and planted Kenmore Church just before COVID, just to give it a bit more spice.
Wow. There's quite a story in all that you've had to share. And of course, we're going to get to talking about how M4 can kind of help play a role in that for the church in Australia, because that's been some of your developing heart's conviction in developing a process. Like I heard you use the word process several times in there. I want, before we even get to M4 and the kind of different components of M4, tell us about what that process meant for you. Like, as you were in the trenches planting Kenmore Church, you weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, and yet you, after years of ministry experience, noticed that there were some things missing or something that you wish that you had in terms of planting. Tell us a bit about that process of planting Kenmore and some of the things that you've learned from that.
Yeah, that's really what became the big issue for me, I guess, because M4 is a church planting organisation or training organisation, but that's just one. It's an answer to one of a sequence of questions that were really bubbling around, and not just my own head, but lots of people who were pursuing these sorts of issues that I was hanging around with at the time. But if I bring it back to what was the root question, it really had to come back to what was first prize. What are we really trying to do as Christian leaders? What does it look like when we get it right? And so I spent some time on that, and really we'd all come up with our own definitions, no doubt. But things like a city or a region full of healthy Christian communities, without defining what those communities look like. But that's what we're after. We want places where the lost get found people grow up, multiplying disciples, kingdom impact. So that's what we all want. But that led to an immediate other question for me, is if God had a heart to grow, for example, 50,000 people, to get them saved and growing in the kingdom, in my area, 50,000 people. If God had a heart to do that, could the churches in the area, could they accommodate that? And the answer came back so quickly, obviously, as a no. We were enamored with our buildings and our budgets, the need for governance and creeds and systems. All these things were gathering together to cap the size and the speed with which the way we're doing church could grow. Our accreditation systems are too slow, a bit restrictive, a bit, for mine, a bit overly academic, because an academic process can only produce an academic outcome. And I was seeing that we needed a leadership outcome. It was a leadership solution, so we needed to grow leaders. And so this presented more questions. What comes from that? So the next question I put to the Lord and to the mentors that I had is, what system or what culture, what approach could scale without limit? What could we do? Just like in the New Testament times, it grew without limits. It wasn't constrained by buildings and budgets. You could use them, but it wasn't constrained by them. And so that answer became very much dependent on our context. And so I was landing in Kenmore, a suburban city church or location, but there was a natural region there. And so for me, I thought I wanted to build the church, not a church. And so rather than being focused purely on one model, which would be the church on the corner, whether that's large or small, because once you build a church in that sense, or you call that the church, it tends to focus on its own capacities and its own systems, what it can produce, what it can control, all that sort of thing, understandably. But then I looked at the home church, micro church, and saw a lot of great things happening in that space as well. But of all the leaders, and I probably quizzed 2 or 3 dozen who had their own micro church networks going on, which had facets that I wanted to incorporate. They seemed to cap out at about 5 or 10 groups before they found organisationally there were some limitations happening there. But I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater there either. So I guess I was after a regional approach that can integrate all of that, the church in the corner where it needed to be, and home-based missional sorts of things, much like how Paul would have done it in Ephesus. And he wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus, not the church on the corner XYZ, And I formulated an approach in our context that was more a regional approach that could use the odd church on the corner, but it could use home-based churches as well, maybe the odd pop-up in there, and we could cover a natural geographic region. And that would provide a lot of savings with time because we could control the governance footprint, the admin footprint. We could incorporate multiple expressions under one entity. And there are all sorts of ways that this would become a better deal for us. We could maximize money spent into mission and ministry, not on buildings, and all these sorts of things. And so I wanted to combine the Sunday gatherings because from what I was hearing, they're far from dead. People still love to come together for a Sunday gathering where there's good leadership and hope and all those sorts of things. But the reality is too that the growth in the kingdom happens best out on the fringes, not on a church on Sunday. It happens in people's workplaces, in their homes, and all those sorts of environments. So we had to combine all of those things into one idea. And that's what we come up with, really, just a regional approach. And so that's what we're on the way to at Kenmore, where we started with a church on the corner, but always with that mindset that we're going to expand out into home-based systems, pop-up church, and so on. So we're moving into that space now that we sort of have critical mass in that area. So M4 for us was just the answer to one part of the question, because the question was about what's gone wrong, and we realized, well, we need new churches for a whole bunch of reasons, but where are the people who's going to lead those churches? So we had a leadership problem. Why have we got a leadership problem? Well, I don't think we ever really quite got discipleship right. And so M4 was just a solution to one part of that, but the rest need answering as well.
That's great. Now, before we dive into the different components of M4, of which we're about to go to next, but I'm just interested to ask you a unscripted leadership question. You take me as someone that has a real knack as a leader of kind of like rubbing up against what are the new things that the Lord wants to do, and sometimes in our institutions, in our denominations, that can inhibit some of that entrepreneurial apostolic thinking. How have you been able to wrestle out some of that? Because I get this sense that you've had forged a new path in a variety of ministry environments that you have been in order to kind of fulfill what the Lord has put on your heart.
I mean, our movements and our denominations aren't structured. They're not created as a leadership entity. They're a service organisation. And so autonomous church, congregation-led churches, of which I'm a part of now, haven't always been that way. These organisations are set up to service them with insurance or training or those sorts of things. So they're not normally have the mindset or cultural systems to lead, to innovate, to pioneer. So they're reactive and not proactive. And so to answer these big questions, I believe we need to partner with our movements, but I think it's going to be the coalition of the willing. It's going to be those who have skin in the game, who are proven leaders, and they're probably going to be one step away from our organisational structures. They might service them. A lot of them are frustrated. They're thinking, oh, these guys can't help us, so they've gone out on their own, doing their own thing. And Australia has some incredible movement leaders who aren't heading our movements. They're growing their own churches in multi-site and doing those sorts of things. But they're the ones that we need to engage in the conversation now to find the answers, because they know what's going on and they know what will work. And so more and more, this is becoming a leadership conversation, but that's not just to diss denominations. I think we still need them. It's a very important role. And I'm on a state council for Church of Christ Queensland. So it's very important that we have a voice in that context, but know what our lane is in each of those meetings and get the job done.
It's great, Pat. Love that. And you definitely pick up on the gist of the question so well in answering that. But hey, I want to bring us to M4 now, and particularly to talk about what is M4, where did it come from, tell us some of the story and background, and begin to tell us the different kind of parts of M4 that our listeners might begin to be able to engage with or find out.
Yeah, I guess the good thing about M4 for me was I wasn't looking for something to do or to take on a new initiative to plant another national enterprise. It was the last thing on my mind. I sort of approached this as a church planter who was training other planters. So I was looking for solutions there. And also then as a representative of our movement statewide to find a system that could help us do that. And so I needed an equipping tool and we found we've got a great college that Church of Christ used in ACOM. It's fantastic. We have others nearby us that the Baptists use, Malyon, there's Sterling, there's great colleges out there. But I wasn't looking for a theological solution here. I was looking for a leadership system. And as a movement leader, I didn't want to necessarily delegate out or farm out the development of our leaders that will be planting churches in our movement. So I wanted to be able to maintain a little bit of control of the DNA, have our people do the training and so on. So that was the rough idea in my head. So rather than sending them out to another system or college somewhere and having them come back and then trying to retrain them into our distinctives, I wanted to try and keep some of it in-house. I was looking for a white label solution, if that means anything to anyone who's listening. But M4, we came across M4 at an Exponential gathering up in Queensland. There was, I think, myself and pretty much every other state movement leader seemed to be in the room. And as Oyvind, the head of M4 Europe, who'd kicked it off in Europe, was speaking, he started talking about how he birthed this thing in Norway, and they planted 12 churches in his local area in Norway. And he had me there because I thought, if you can plant a church in Norway, you can do it anywhere. Surely that's the most cold relational climate in the world. So he certainly got our attention, but it's since spread to 15 other countries and 2 more since then, and still growing. And I thought, well, if it works there, it's going to work here. And we wanted to hear what he had to say. But the issues that really attracted us beyond that was just the approach, because it's a leadership system, and it approaches it in a way that it's a facilitated team approach. So you're not just planting the church planter and perhaps their spouse. You're training and equipping the whole team, because there's a realization now, particularly among young Gen Zs, Gen Y leaders, that no one person has all it takes to plant a church, and they don't want to kill themselves on the altar of church life like my generation tended to do, just all out at the expense of our families and so on. They're a much more balanced approach, so they need a team around them. And M4 really does accommodate that sort of team framework. It coaches and trains the whole team together, and even accommodates the fact that some may drop off and some will come in that process. The other thing was, it wasn't a classroom environment. There are learning communities, but the content, and it's pretty full on, the content. The content's done separately via online and via manuals and so on, but it's all done over a 2-year process, and it's over the process in which they're planting the church. So they may start M4 before they plant. They can plant anywhere in there, and then the training and the coaching goes on after. So they help them in that really important stage of pre and post church plant. And then just the fact that it's got learning communities that are doing it right. We can do learning communities well and not so well, but these guys were really doing it well. It's very process oriented. It's got the coaching, so it's very one-on-one. And for me particularly, it had the pragmatic element really nailed in how do I contextualize the gospel? How do I learn how to do it for my area rather than it being prescribed for me? How do I learn how to learn? How do you form your own model and vision that God's giving you? It had multiplication sort of woven in. So from the moment you're planting a church, that church should be planting other churches. That's written into the DNA. But beyond all that, that was a church planting process, and that was good enough, to be honest. But the hidden kicker that really added later on was the fact that it gave a recruitment pipeline for young adults. Because as I talk to movement leaders, we're all struggling, it seems, except maybe 1 or 2, with having enough new leaders coming through the pipeline ready to do church planting. And so the M4 Ready, which is a separate program to the planting process, provided a big funnel for young adults to come from all sorts of movements and denominations together, or they can stick with their denomination. And they can be exposed to the ideas and the training of church planting, leadership, personal development in a 1-year program. And that really lit us up as we saw, great, this is a way that we can get kids in a room and they can have a look and a taste and say, I hadn't ever thought about that before, but I could be part of a team. I could do this. And that looked really good to me. But I guess, and lastly, I guess there was a couple of other elements. So being female friendly, that was a deal for us, which we didn't want to have any restriction theologically. We weren't defining people's theology. We wanted women. God is growing women. And if I've seen the Lord doing anything at the moment in my orbit, it's church planting and women in leadership. And I've done a bit of history on this. I don't know whether you've noticed this, Charlie, but whenever there's a genuine revival, the Holy Spirit's doing his work, that church planting and women in leadership actually come together. And for the Azusa Street in 1901, 60% of the churches that came out of that were planted by females. And but normally within a generation, patriarchy takes back over, and we revert back to our older ways. So I was looking for that to be addressed, and something that was a little bit more ecumenical, could deal with multiple movements at once. So it ticked all those boxes, and the rest is history.
So good, Pat. And we absolutely cheer on and champion what you're doing and think that's such a significant attribute of what M4 is about and bringing to the Australian ecosystem, particularly as we talk about what it means to reach the 84%, those outside of the country, the church in Australia. We know that they're going to have to be churches that plant churches, female church planters. And I would absolutely wholeheartedly agree with you that as we look to Europe, which we're described to be far more post-Christian or even pre-Christian, again, much more secularized in nature. I actually think we're going to get a lot of our forecasting of what we need to be aware of missiologically from Europe rather than even from North America, as much as we honor what the Lord has done there.
Absolutely, yeah. We seem to take... I tried America first, and then I realised there was just such a difference in many of the underlying cultural elements. We took our lead more from the UK, and then that bled over into Europe, and that just seemed to provide some answers to questions that we just couldn't find answers to otherwise.
It's great. It's great. And the other thing I love about what you said, and I think this is a very real issue for the church in Australia, is how we're mobilising maybe denominations and movements that don't yet have some sort of strategy. Maybe there's a heart for it, but what are they going to do about it? That's where something like M4 can come alongside. And further to that, when it comes to, all right, well, we need to develop pipelines of younger leaders. And sadly, even for my story, I didn't hear about church planting until I was 30 years of age, whereas I would have loved to hear about it when I was 16, 17, 18, casting a vision and a foretaste for what young people might be able to do, either as part of a team or as a leader, and definitely acknowledging that the next generation is going to have bold, innovative, creative ways of reaching people that we as maybe more seasoned leaders in Australia haven't even started to think about. And I guess that brings me to...
have to be,
yeah, absolutely. And I guess that brings me to, particularly if someone's listening today and going, I'm a denomination leader, I'm a church leader, some of this stuff is really starting to push my buttons in a really good way. How could they connect with M4? What is the best way for them to kind of look up what you guys are doing and beginning to offer around Australia? What's the next step?
Yeah, obviously they can go to the website. It's all there at m4australia.org. But there's many ways they can connect with me personally as well. The email address is all there. But the way we want to work with movements, and I think we're leaning more into working with movements than we are with individual church planters, even though absolutely we can do that. But as a movement leader myself, I understand that we need to get traction. We need to get critical mass. We need to get our own people that may already be on staff at our movements to get them doing the training, the coaching, so that our own DNA stays there, all while we can still get in the room with other movements and together create these environments where there's 200 or 300 young adults in there hearing the vision together from all different sorts of movements, that there's a new day coming, and the role of people like myself is not to do it for them, but to create a space where they can experiment, and we've got their back and we're resourcing them and giving them the insights at a principle level rather than a prescriptive level. So the movements, we want to partner with movements in that sense, and we're already talking to, I think, a dozen movements, state movements now, ready to kick off some training in this September. But every 6 months, that training is going to restart again as we cycle through different cohorts. But the material itself is accessible online, so we give logins to the online training system. We're going to be contextualizing that over the next few years with all Australian content, all Australian stories. At the moment, we're tapping into the European content, which is fantastic, but it'll be great to get Australian stories in there. And so movements can come to us, particularly in September, where we're going to be training coaches, assessors, facilitators from those movements and our own group as well, so that if WA Baptist or South Australian Church of Christ want to do the training themselves, their people can be equipped to do that, and they just get access to our material. So at that level, it's almost like a wholesale arrangement. They can get involved. And the process itself then becomes a sequence of learning communities every 6 months or so. And in between those learning communities, the online content is gone through. But none of it's an easy road. I've got to put it that way. There's no coast. I'm involved in a number of learning communities, And sometimes the learning, it happens when you're together over a couple of days, and then there's a 6-month break and we just check in. How you going? Have you done what you said you were going to do? We take it up a level here. We give the learning community workshops, what you've already learnt, and says, now, how do we apply that? How do we get this done? What's our next goal set going to be? And then coming out of that community, the coach comes in alongside that team then and helps them fulfill what they've committed to doing while they're learning the next bunch of content. And so it's very practical, but it gives you very pragmatic sort of next steps. And so we can either train the staff or the coaches for different movements, or we can do it as M4 as well, because we've got our own people doing it. It's really, we want to give flexibility. It's just vital that we put fuel behind movements to do it the way they need to do it, in a way that's going to work for them. Our goal here is not to build a huge organization that is M4. M4 serves movements. We've all got our eye on one prize here right now. We've got to plant churches. We've got to grow leaders. So we're in with the same thing. And we're going to keep this very lean and mean, but it's here to fuel movements. And the public won't know who M4 is. It won't be a brand that's out there, in a retail sense too much. We're here to serve movements and get behind them, give them what they need.
And Pat, just as a final question, you were getting a bit of a roll on there. Obviously, this is a huge passion of yours. This is something, this is the hill that you want to die on in terms of, the future of the church in Australia and actually seeing the church mobilise and reach people. And I just wanted to ask, just as a final question today, as one who has been, is a seasoned leader in the church in Australia, has been around for a couple of years and done a lot of deep thinking about this kind of stuff. What's your hunch? What's your passion? What's the thing that you are aching and praying and hoping to see happen in and within the church in Australia over the course of the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I guess. I've got a national picture in my head, but we're all just one cog in that big machine, and it's not about any of us, I guess, particularly. But I do know what the Lord's been pressing into me. I've got one mission, one story, but I guess there's a couple of facets of that, and M4 fulfills one aspect of that for me. But I've been on this journey, as you say, for 20 years in church world in full-time sense. But the thing that's been fueling much of this is I call it taking people from faithfulness to fruitfulness. Church people are wonderful people, but often our highest expression of Christianity is a faithful, persevering believer. And that's admirable. It's great. We need faithfulness. It's just not adequate. There's just no way we can fulfill the mission and the great commandments that's been given to us in our own strength. Faithfulness will never be enough. We've got to move from faithfulness to fruitfulness. And John 15:5, Jesus said, you can only bear fruit if you abide in me. Go and make disciples of all the world. I am with you. And there's this element of where we need to rediscover the Holy Spirit. In a deep and a thorough experiential and cultural way. And we've got to learn that as leaders, I think, we've got to move from seeing our primary objective as being competent at leading teams and teaching people, and develop a whole new skill, which is, in my sort of language, becoming an artisan of creating spaces where God and people can engage in a transformative way. So I've written sort of 8 books on this, and we've taken over 10,000 people through different forms of material. But this is what we're trying to do: is we do our job well as leaders, but we've got to have and find ways and understand the ways where God wants to engage and transform hearts, because it's only full hearts that can fulfill the mission. So what's our goal as leaders? It's to create the spaces where people's hearts can be full. So there's a formation piece to be talked about, coupled with and integrated with a missional piece. And we tend to want to have one or the other. But I think the secret sauce is going to be in putting those together. Otherwise, this mission that we're talking about, the mission's impossible. We can't do it. We can't do it in our own strength. Being faithful won't be adequate. So there's an empowerment of the Holy Spirit. We put all sorts of labels. We have all sorts of challenges with what that means. But of all the fruit I've seen, it's been a partnership between leaders and God's people doing their role, knowing what it is, and the Spirit doing what only the Spirit can do. And that leads to probably the other side of it, is clarifying as leaders and committing to what our contribution is and knowing what God's contribution is to this whole conversation and this whole goal of what we're trying to do. Because every discipleship and every leadership system I've seen, and I've looked at everything I can get my hands on for 20 years now, they seem to be almost exclusively human-centric. It's like we expect people to do the very best they have with the strength that they have. Go and learn more, practice more, figure it out. But it's human strength we're talking about. But we need more than that. We need God's strength. But what's our role then? Is it all God, or is it all us, or what is it? And the breakthrough moment for me is reading 1 Corinthians 3:6. Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So we take the mandate to go and make disciples, and we try and do that in our own strength, but we forget, I'm with you always. So we try to define success by a lagging goal. The lagging goal being disciples are being made, or churches are being grown, or something like that. Jesus said he would build the church. He was taking responsibility for the lagging goal. He expected us to control the leading goal, to provide inputs into the system. He controls what happens next and what comes out. And so for me, that clarified a lot. It gave me great freedom. What are my inputs to the system? Well, same as Paul, Paul planted, Apollos watered. So we plant, we water, we teach, we mentor, we do all that sort of stuff. But then we take our hands off and we say, Lord, you must work. And learning how to differentiate those roles and becoming that artisan of creating those spaces, that became the big deal for me. And that was a game changer. So I think if we can rediscover again, because the task that's before us is too big for us. The truth is it always has been. We found a way to get around it somewhat, But I think if we learn how to partner powerfully, credibly, substantively with the Holy Spirit, coupled with great theology, good teaching and good practice, I think that's where the secret's going to lie.
Pat, it's been an absolute gift to have you on the podcast today. We're cheering you on, particularly as M4 gets going here in Australia. We're dear friends of M4, and we're absolutely cheering on your leadership and the different churches we hope to be planted in and around Australia.
Bless you, Charlie. Yeah, I couldn't have done it without Exponential. It's absolutely true. It all happens at Exponential, these meetings. So,
Amen.
It's likewise.
So good. Thanks, Pat.